The clink of ice against glass was a language Zola understood. It spoke of wealth, of leisure, of conversations that floated on expensive gin, and the low hum of a professionally managed dining room. She moved through the soundscape like a ghost in her crisp black and white uniform, her tray a silver shield. Her job was to be invisible, an efficient pair of hands that refilled water and cleared plates without disturbing the delicate ecosystem of power and influence that was lunch service at Elysian. She was good at it. Her shyness, a liability in most parts of her life, was an asset here. It made her quiet, observant, and utterly forgettable to the men and women who conducted million-dollar deals over seared scallops. She kept her eyes down, her movements fluid, and her thoughts on the German literature midterm she was supposed to be studying for. That was the only reason she noticed. The party of four had commanded attention the moment they arrived. Not because they were loud, but because they were the opposite. A bubble of silence and pressure expanded from their corner table, warping the restaurant's cheerful ambience. Two were German, with polished, predatory smiles and suits that looked stiff and expensive. One was their translator, a man with a nervous sheen of sweat on his upper lip. And the fourth was the center of gravity. Kwon Jin-woo. His name was a whisper among the staff. The owner of half the new high-rises piercing the city skyline, and, if the rumors were true, the unseen hand guiding a much darker empire. He was unervingly still, seated in a wheelchair that was more throne than medical device. It was matte black carbon fiber, clinical and severe. It didn't make him look weak. It made him look enthroned, a king surveying his court from a seat of cold, hard reality. His suit was a deep charcoal, tailored so perfectly it seemed fused to his broad shoulders. Nothing about him was soft, except for the cashmere of his jacket. His face was carved from unforgiving stone, his eyes holding a flat, chilling emptiness that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Zola's German was a quiet rebellion, a minor in a degree she was paying for by hauling plates of overpriced fish. It was a world away from this one, a language of poetry and philosophy. But the German spoken at this table was the language of commerce, sharp and brutal. She was refilling water glasses, her movements practiced and silent, when the words sliced through the restaurant's hum. The agreement cedes full distribution rights in the Eastern Corridor for a 7% stake. The translator, Klaus, said in clear, precise German to the two executives. Zola's hand paused for a fraction of a second over a glass. One of the Germans nodded, a smug little twitch of his lips. And he accepts the liability clause as written. He accepts, Klaus confirmed. Then, Klaus turned to Kwon Jin-woo. His voice shifted, becoming smoother, more deferential as he spoke in English, the supposed bridge between them. Sir, they have agreed to your terms. 10% stake, and they assume all liability for transport. Zola froze. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a nuance of language. It was a lie. A clean, 3% cut off the top and a complete reversal of a multi-million-dollar risk. She could feel the blood drain from her face. This was not her business. Her job was to pour the water, smile vaguely, and disappear. Getting involved was insane. These were not men who tolerated complications. Kwon Jin-woo, especially, looked like he didn't tolerate the continued existence of oxygen if it inconvenienced him. She backed away from the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to force it down, to retreat back into the safety of her invisibility. But her feet felt rooted to the floor. She watched as one of Jin-woo's men, standing sentry a few feet away, placed a heavy folder and an expensive fountain pen on the table. The German executives leaned back, their smiles widening. Victory was a scent in the air, thick and cloying. Jin-woo picked up the pen. His hands were large, his fingers long and elegant, a stark contrast to the coiled stillness of his body. He uncapped it with a quiet, deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. He didn't hesitate. His movements were all calculation. He was bringing the nib down to the signature line. Zola's mind screamed. The lie was so blatant, so audacious. The translator was stealing from a man who looked like he measured his life in the debts of others, debts often paid in blood. And she was the only one in the room who knew. Her body moved before her brain could veto the suicidal impulse. She glided forward, the water pitcher still in her hand, her face a mask of professional calm she did not feel. She leaned over Jinwoo's shoulder, ostensibly to top off his water glass, bringing her mouth close to his ear. The air around him smelled of cedar and something cold, like winter air. "Don't sign it," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Your translator is lying." The world stopped. The pen froze, the nib hovering a millimeter from the paper. For a long, drawn-out second, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Kwon Jinwoo turned his head. His eyes, dark and depthless, found hers. There was no shock in them.
No confusión.
Just a sudden, terrifying focus, as if a predator had just caught a new and unexpected scent on the wind. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The question was there, cold and absolute. The German executives were starting to look confused. The translator, Klaus, shot Zola a venomous glare, his face pale with panic. Jinwoo held her gaze. The silence stretched, becoming a physical thing, a weight pressing down on the entire restaurant. He placed the pen down on the table, the click echoing the finality of a closing cell door. He then lifted a single, elegant finger and crooked it, beckoning the guard who stood nearest to him. "The meeting is over," Jinwoo said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried easily. He never looked away from Zola. "Show our guests out. And Klaus, you will wait for me in the car." The command was delivered softly, but it landed like a hammer blow. The Germans, sputtering protests, were firmly escorted from the restaurant. Klaus looked like he was about to be physically ill, but he scurried away, his treachery clinging to him like a cheap suit. The restaurant was still full, but the corner table now felt like a vacuum, sucking in all the air and sound. Jinwoo's men formed a discreet perimeter. Zola was still standing there, trapped in his gaze, the heavy water pitcher suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had just detonated a bomb and was left standing in the crater, waiting for the fallout. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Her legs, trembling, obeyed. She sank into the plush chair opposite him, the rich leather cool against her skin. She placed the pitcher on the table with a hand that shook so badly she was surprised it didn't shatter the glass. "You speak German," he stated. "A little," she managed, her voice a squeak. "I'm a student." "You understood enough to risk your life." His eyes narrowed, dissecting her. He was looking for an angle, a motive. In his world, altruism didn't exist.
Why?
"He was stealing from you," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "He told them you were taking 7% and all the liability. He told you it was 10% and none." A flicker of something, not surprise, but confirmation, passed through his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, the movement smooth and controlled. He studied her, his gaze sweeping over her simple uniform, her nervous hands, her wide, terrified eyes. He seemed to be cataloging every detail, filing it away. "What is your name?"
Zola.
He tasted the name, his lips barely moving. Zola, he said it differently than anyone else ever had. Not soft, but precise. As if it were a piece of information he was now taking ownership of. "My organization spends millions on vetting our people. Security, background checks, loyalty tests. And a waitress with a German minor found the traitor in 5 minutes. He wasn't angry. He sounded clinical, almost amused, in a terrifying, bloodless way. The manager, a perpetually flustered man named Mr. Davies, scurried over. "Is everything all right, Mr. Kwon? I can assure you this employee will be dealt with." Jinwoo raised a hand, and Mr. Davies fell silent, as if his vocal cords had been severed. "She is no longer your employee. She works for me now." He turned his gaze back to Zola, pinning her to the chair. "Her shift is over. Get your things. You're coming with me." There was no room for argument in his tone. The choice had been made for her the moment she decided to speak. Her old life, with its simple worries of tuition and exams, had just ended. She had stepped out of the background and into the world of a man who moved through life with the lethal grace of a shark, even when confined to a chair. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of doors slamming shut behind her, locking her into a future she could never have imagined. The ride to his penthouse was a study in silent intimidation. Zola sat on the plush leather of the town car, as far from him as she could get. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, a world she was no longer a part of. Jean Wu didn't speak. He simply watched the city, his profile stark and unyielding. The man named Klaus was nowhere to be seen. Zola didn't dare ask. His home was less an apartment and more a fortress in the sky. It occupied the entire top floor of one of the newest, most severe glass and steel towers downtown. The elevator opened directly into a vast living space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the city. The decor was minimalist and brutalist: concrete walls, black leather furniture, gleaming chrome, and not a single personal touch. It was a space designed for control, not comfort. He wheeled himself to the center of the room, his chair moving silently over the polished concrete floor. "My head of security will take your statement," he said, his tone dismissing her. "Tell him everything you heard. Every word." But Zola found a sliver of courage, born of pure adrenaline. "What happens to me after that?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers again. "You have become a person of interest. My enemies now know there was a disruption to our meeting. They will want to know what that disruption was. Leaving you to go back to your life would be a death sentence. For you." The implication was chilling. He wasn't protecting her out of kindness. He was securing a loose end. She was a piece on his chessboard now, and he would not allow her to be captured by the other side. For the next few hours, she was questioned by a grim-faced man who introduced himself only as Choi. She recounted the conversation at the table, her German precise from years of study. Choi recorded everything, his expression unreadable. When he was done, she was shown to a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. It was as sterile and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. It had a bed, a dresser, and a window with a view that could make a person dizzy. It felt like a beautiful cage. Later that night, unable to sleep, she wandered out into the main living area. It was dark, save for the glittering tapestry of city lights outside the massive windows. She found him there, his wheelchair positioned in front of the glass, a solitary figure against the skyline. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, but he wasn't drinking, just staring out at the empire he commanded. "You're awake," he said, without turning. "I can't sleep. You are in the home of a stranger who has, for all intents and purposes, kidnapped you." Insomnia is an appropriate response. There was a dry, almost imperceptible humor in his voice. She moved to stand a few feet away, wrapping her arms around herself. "That car accident, the one that—" She trailed off, not knowing how to finish. "The one that put me in this chair," he finished for her, his voice flat. "It was a year ago. A rival faction thought a public assassination was too messy. They arranged for a transport truck to lose its brakes on a mountain road." He took a sip of his drink. "They were very thorough." That was the moment she understood. This wasn't just about business. The betrayal by Klaus was a symptom of a much deeper wound. "The man driving my car," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "was Minjun. We grew up together. He was my right hand, my brother in all but blood. He died instantly." The words were delivered without emotion, but Zola could feel the weight of them, the cold, hard grief buried beneath the surface. That was his vulnerability. Not the chair, but the memory of the man who died in it, a betrayal that had cost him his mobility and his most trusted friend. He had failed to protect someone, and the price was written into his own body every single day. "The deal today," he said, finally turning to look at her, his eyes dark in the dim light. "It was with the same faction. Klaus was their key. He was helping them finish the job they started last year." Zola felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She wasn't just a witness to a business deal gone wrong. She had stumbled into the middle of a war. "They will be looking for you now," he said. "They know someone warned me. So, I'm a prisoner." You are a complication, he corrected. But you are my complication, and I protect what is mine. He wheeled himself closer, stopping just before her. He was looking up at her, a position of physical vulnerability that was completely negated by the sheer force of his presence. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was not gentle, but it wasn't rough, either. It was firm, possessive. A claim. I need you to look over the original documents. All of them are in German. I need to know the full extent of the trap they laid. He was asking for her help. Forcing her, yes, but also admitting he needed her skill. It was a subtle shift in the power dynamic. She was no longer just a waitress he'd swept up. She was an asset. A vital one. She looked down at their joined hands. His was large and warm, calloused around the knuckles. Hers was trembling. She should have been terrified. A part of her was. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, recognized the strange, dangerous safety of this man's orbit. The world outside this penthouse was trying to kill her. In here, with him, she was a target, but she was also defended by the most dangerous man she had ever met. Okay, she heard herself say. I'll help you. It was a deliberate choice. She could have refused, screamed, demanded to be let go. But she knew it was pointless. And somewhere deep inside, she knew she didn't want to. She had made a decision in the restaurant to step into his world.
Now she was choosing to stay.
The next few days were a blur of tension and proximity. Zola spent hours at the massive glass desk in his office, poring over contracts and financial statements, her German vocabulary expanding to include terms for shell corporations and hostile takeovers. Jinwoo was a constant presence, either working silently beside her or directing his empire from his chair with quiet, lethal commands over a secured line. The proximity was suffocating. She became hyper-aware of him. The scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp cedar. The quiet whir of his wheelchair on the polished floors. The way his dark eyes would watch her when he thought she wasn't looking. A silence grew between them that was heavier than words, charged with unspoken questions. He learned she liked her tea with honey. She learned he never slept for more than 4 hours at a time. They were two isolated planets, slowly being drawn into the same gravitational pull. The attack came without warning. It was late. Zola was rubbing her tired eyes, a half-dozen documents still left to translate, when the world exploded in a shower of glass. The floor-to-ceiling window in the living area shattered inwards, and 3 figures in black tactical gear rappelled into the room. Choi and another guard were there in an instant, gunfire erupting in the cavernous space. Jinwoo reacted with chilling speed. He didn't panic. He moved. He spun his chair, shoving the heavy desk with surprising force to create a barrier, and pulled Zola down behind it with him. His body shielded hers, his arm a band of steel around her waist. Stay down, he snarled, his voice a guttural command right next to her ear. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her neck, a shocking point of intimacy in the middle of chaos. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and shattered glass. A bullet ricocheted off the chrome leg of the desk, whining past her head. He was a tactician, even in a firefight. He issued commands to his men in Korean, his voice never rising, never cracking. He was directing the defense, seeing angles they didn't, a general commanding his troops. But one of the attackers broke through, vaulting over the sofa. He was moving toward them, his weapon raised. Jinwoo shoved Zola further behind him, shielding her completely with his own body. He drew a pistol from a holster concealed beneath his jacket with a fluid motion that spoke of long practice. But the attacker was fast. A shot rang out, and Zola felt Jinwoo jolt against her. A dark stain blossomed on the shoulder of his white shirt. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. But it was immediately followed by a white-hot surge of rage. This man, this cold, calculating, wounded man, had just put his body between her and a bullet. The attacker was momentarily distracted by Choi, who engaged him from the side. In that split second, Zola saw her chance. The man was down on one knee, turning to fire again. Near her hand was a heavy award of some kind, a solid block of crystal on a marble base. Her survival instinct and a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness took over. She scrambled out from behind Jinwoo, grabbing the heavy object. She didn't think. She acted. She brought it down with all her strength on the attacker's wrist as he aimed his gun. There was a sickening crunch of bone. The gun clattered to the floor. The man screamed, a raw sound of agony. Before he could recover, Choi was on him, and it was over. The silence that descended was deafening, broken only by the man's pained whimpers and the distant wail of sirens. Zola stood, her chest heaving, the crystal award still clutched in her hand, slick with sweat. She had just crossed a line. She had participated in the violence, met it with her own. A part of the shy, invisible waitress was gone forever, shattered like the window behind her. She turned to Jinwoo. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were blazing with a raw, fierce intensity she had never seen before. He was bleeding, but he didn't seem to notice. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. He ignored the question. "You should have stayed hidden. He was going to kill you." His men were securing the room, dragging the intruders away. The immediate danger was over, but the air was thick with the aftermath. Zola went to the bar, her hands on autopilot, grabbing a bottle of whiskey and a clean bar towel. She knelt before his chair. "Let me see," she said, her voice firmer now. He didn't protest. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, as she carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was a deep graze, bleeding freely, but not life-threatening. She poured the whiskey over the towel, ignoring his sharp intake of breath as she pressed the makeshift antiseptic dressing to his shoulder. Her hands were steady now. The adrenaline had forged a new kind of calm in her. They were inches apart. She could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the slight tremor of pain in his jaw. He was not made of stone after all. "You are more dangerous than any of them," he said, his voice a low rasp. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession. "Why?" she whispered, her fingers brushing his skin as she secured the dressing. "Because they only want to kill me," he said, his dark eyes boring into hers. You make me forget what I am." He reached up with his good hand and gripped her wrist. His touch was electric, a current that shot straight through her. "I told myself keeping you here was for your protection, that you were an asset. I was lying to myself. That was it. The confession. Not of love, but of something far more potent and perilous. An admission of a crack in his armor. An acknowledgement of the truth that had been building between them in the silent, watchful hours." The next day, Choi brought them the news. The attackers had been carrying a photo of her. A grainy shot taken from across the street from the restaurant. They had her name. They knew who she was. She was no longer just a witness. She was a primary target. The war was no longer just his. It was hers, too. The plan was audacious. Jinwoo intended to use the enemy's own greed against them. He arranged a new meeting, leaking information that he was rattled, ready to concede to their original terms to stop the violence. He would use Zola as his new translator, a sign of his supposed desperation. It was a trap, and she was the bait. She stood in a different pristine suit, this one provided for her, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. An earpiece was tucked in her ear, feeding her the hushed instructions of Jinwoo's security team. She was terrified, but a strange, cold calm had settled over her. She was no longer the girl who hid on the sidelines. The meeting took place in a private suite at a neutral hotel. The Germans were there, along with a new man, the one Choi had identified as the ringleader of the rival faction. Jinwoo was calm, his face an unreadable mask, but Zola could see the tension coiled in his shoulders. Her job was to translate, to play the part of the intimidated but necessary accessory, and to listen. As the meeting progressed, she relayed the lies and postures back to Jinwoo. But through the earpiece, she heard Choi's frantic whisper. "They're not alone. We have 2 shooters on the roof opposite. It's an ambush. They plan to take you all out once the deal is signed." There was no time. The ringleader was pushing the documents across the table, his smile like a shark's. Warning Jinwoo out loud would get them all killed.
She had to do something.
In that split second, her eyes darted around the room. A waiter was approaching with a tray of champagne glasses. It was her only chance. As the waiter passed her chair, Zola's leg shot out. She didn't just trip him. She sent him sprawling, the tray of glasses flying through the air with an explosive crash. Champagne and shattered glass sprayed across the table, drenching the documents and the men around it. Chaos erupted. In that moment of confusion, Zola screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure panic. It was the perfect diversion. The ringleader and his men instinctively reached for their weapons, their cover blown. But it was too late. Jinwoo's men, positioned discreetly as hotel staff, moved in. The fight was brutal, efficient, and short. When the silence fell again, Zola was trembling, backed against a wall. Jinwoo wheeled himself through the wreckage of the room, his eyes finding her instantly. The cold mask was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded. He stopped in front of her, the chaos of the room fading into the background. "My world is not safe for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She met his gaze, unflinching. "My old world wasn't safe either. It was just a different kind of danger. At least here," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I know which direction the threat is coming from." It was her choice, made in the crucible of violence and fear. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. She was staying. The cost was her past, her innocence, the life she thought she would have. But what she was gaining, what she was claiming, was something else entirely. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was no longer just a claim. It was a promise. "From now on," he said, his voice a low vow that sealed her fate and his, "you stay by my side." It was not a question. It was the new and absolute truth of her life.